Just a very brief word about Clinigen, who are obviously sponsoring the meeting today. We're delighted to be able to support this particular meeting. Clinigen is a specialty pharmaceutical services company. We are a pharmaceutical services company in our own right. We own our own products. We distribute our own products globally on both a license and a named patients basis across the world. We also specialise in the provision of services to pharma and biotech companies. Firstly, we specialise in the provision of comparator products for clinical trials, but also we specialise in the consultancy, implementation and management of global access programs on behalf of pharma and biotech companies that have products coming through development that are meeting unmet medical need that they're wanting to make available to patients prior to those products being commercially available on the market. And my role within Clinigen as Strategic Planning Director is overseeing what we call our Global Access Programs Division. And over the last 4 years, I've personally been involved in the implementation of 25 global access programs with the provision of innovative new products to patients prior to them being commercially available, and believe that gives us an element of experience to be able to talk about the challenges and the options that exist for yourselves. So before we go into sort of the detail, just to get us all on the same page, I just wanted really to focus on what exactly we're talking about when we mean early access. And it's really a very simple phenomenon. And it's about a mechanism that enables patients with an unmet medical need to be provided with access to medicine prior to that medicine being commercially available in that particular patient's country. It's a very simple statement. There's a huge lot of complexity that goes behind that particular mechanism. But in the area of orphan drugs particularly, we see this as an incredibly prevalent and increasingly used mechanism to allow patients to access drugs. And I think some of the discussions, particularly on the panel this morning, highlighted how desperate, in a number of cases, patients are to get their hands on products prior to them actually being formally available on the marketplace. But if it is so difficult, why should it be considered? Why should pharma and biotech companies go out of your way alongside your clinical development programs to make products available? Well, I think first and foremost is the amount of unmet medical need. Again, particularly in orphan designation areas that exists and warrants a decision to be made to try and make products available prior to their commercial availability. I think going with that unmet medical need is the limited treatment options that are available for patients. Many patients, as we've heard, in orphan designation diseases simply do not have any other option at all apart from a product that's maybe still in clinical development. We're dealing with very innovative products in this type of forum, and you do get an increased level of pre-approval demand in this particular environment. And the environment is shifting and changing. Even in the last 4 or 5 years, I think I've witnessed an increased level of demand for access to medicines prior to them being available on the market. And I propose there's probably 3 key factors that really are contributing to this at this moment in time. We've heard a lot this morning already from patient groups. I think patients themselves are so much better informed than they ever have been before. They have more access to information, particularly via the internet, not just of products that are on the market, but products in development that are going through phase 2 clinical trials, into phase 3 clinical trials, and they are aware of these products, particularly if they have a high degree of unmet medical need. They're researching their condition, they're researching their loved one's condition, and they're often the ones that are going to their physicians asking for access to drugs that are still in clinical development. If you couple that with a better informed physician base than ever before, we think the international medical fraternity is so tightly knit now. Again, with the advent of modern technology, key opinion leaders across the world are very well informed of medicines that are in development, that are coming to market, particularly if they're dealing with very specialist areas, and particularly if they're interested in areas such as orphan designation diseases. So you have an increasingly better informed physician base. But you couple that, we've already heard again this afternoon about the challenges of bringing these products to market and the time it takes to get not just approval, but when you have approval, some of the pricing and reimbursement negotiations can be quite elongated, and it can take time to formally have products available with full pricing and reimbursement across many countries. Even in Europe that's the case. You look at products with centralised EMA approval, a number of the major markets are 12, 18 months, 24 months post-centralised approval before those drugs are commercially available on the market, having gone through formal pricing and reimbursement negotiations. So when you combine these three factors together, particularly where you have a high element of unmet medical need, there's an increasingly positive environment for providing access to medicines prior to approval. But as a pharma or biotech company, thinking about the challenges that exist, I mean, the first challenge you have to decide as an organisation with a product in development is, will you make it available or not? There's a huge amount of pressure from patient groups, from physicians, but you have a big decision to make. What are the benefits or what are the risks of making your product available prior to approval? If you decide to make your product available to patients prior to its approval, what controls can you put in place? What are the ethical, the regulatory requirements? Carlos already has alluded to the complexity of the regulatory requirements in this area. What data would you like to collect? How do you deal with country requests coming from all over the world? And how do you actually resource that when your resources really are focused on bringing the product to market and gaining full marketing authorization and reimbursement? But also couple with this, but what are the objectives for early access as well? And we would propose that there's probably two key areas here that you should consider. You clearly have objectives through the product's development of gathering data through your clinical trials to gain a marketing authorization. For that, clinical trials are exactly the right route. But if you have objectives about providing access to patients and to physicians prior to approval that isn't directly linked to any form of data collection, then there's other routes that allow you to make products available outside of the clinical trial environment. So what are those routes? Well, this is where it starts to get incredibly complex, and we'll try and simplify things in a very, very basic level here. You can essentially split the world into two when you're thinking about early access, because you have very different mechanisms in the USA versus the rest of the world. The USA has incredibly clear criteria in place. The legislation was updated by the FDA in the August of 2009. And there's three routes to allowing patients access to medicines in the US prior to their approval. There's what's called a single patient IND. And this is for an individual patient to be allowed to gain access to medicine in the US for a medicine that's not yet approved in the US. But it's a very burdensome route for the physician. The treating physician has to interact directly with the FDA to actually gain approval to use a product through a single patient IND. And for the scale of the US, this route is not used very, very frequently at all. The routes that are used much more frequently are what's called a treatment and an intermediate INDs. Now, these are essentially similar mechanisms, but it's just the scale of them that varies. And for an intermediate IND, you're talking about allowing access to maybe up to 100 patients in the US prior to a product being approved. So again, for a number of orphan designations, that can be completely the appropriate route for providing access to a medicine in the US. A treatment IND is essentially a much bigger version of that for much wider numbers of patients. The difference with the US is that the treatment and the intermediate INDs are very much like running a clinical trial. It's a very proactive mechanism that's put in place by a pharma biotech company. There's a protocol that has to be written to govern how the treatment or the intermediate IND is managed. The protocol has to be approved by the FDA. And when the protocol is then approved and in place, you can go out and recruit sites, centres, investigators into your IND to allow patients in the US access to a particular product. But because it's quite like a clinical trial, it's quite a large investment. And it's often the preserve really of large pharma that can afford to implement these types of mechanisms and schemes in the US. There are mechanisms that allow you to recoup some costs of putting these types of schemes in place. The updated legislation in 2009 allowed for that, but it doesn't allow you to recoup significant funds, and it's still really a challenge for smaller pharma companies and for biotech companies to have the resources available to invest in this type of mechanism in the US prior to a product's approval. The rest of the world, there's a whole host of different terminology that's used here, and this was alluded to earlier already. You know, people call this different things outside the United States. It can be called early access, expanded access, compassionate use, named patient, and there's individual country variances as well. Certain countries like France have the ATU scheme. It's very well documented, very well legislated, but it's a completely different terminology to the rest of Europe. Now, we like to try and simplify things because these terms are used interchangeably company to company, and also country to country. So we would use the term a named patient program to describe the mechanism that exists outside of the United States to allow patients to access a drug prior to approval. And the reason we use this particular term is although the legislation differs across the world and although the regulations differ across the world, there are three core elements that do sit and are commonalities when you look at allowing access for medicines prior to approval outside of the US. And the first one, which makes this a very different mechanism to the US particularly, is that this must be an unsolicited approach by a healthcare professional. So you cannot go and recruit patients into your named patient program rest of world. What you're doing is putting a mechanism in place that should physicians or patients through their physicians look to gain access to a particular medicine in an unsolicited manner, you have a solution in place that allows you to respond to that. If a physician is coming to you with the clinical judgment they believe a product in development would benefit a patient in their care, they then have to make a judgment based on two core criteria. One, does that patient have a degree of unmet medical need? And very often in the field of orphan diseases, there is a degree of unmet medical need that patient is suffering from. And there shouldn't be an alternative treatment available in that particular country. And if those two things ring true, then that treating physician can make a request to access a particular medicine from the pharma company or the biotech company. The company is completely within its rights to decide whether they wish or they don't wish to allow that physician to access the drug, but it's the physician that has to drive that process. And it's the physician's responsibility to go through the regulatory process in their own country to ensure that they're allowed to physically import the drug into their country and use the drug on an unlicensed or a named patient basis. So what is the regulatory landscape? And this is where it gets even more complex. We've talked about the United States, very clear in the US, updated legislation, August 2009, that gives very clear criteria for allowing patients in the US access to medicines prior to approval. Europe has got relatively clear criteria because there's an EU directive, Article 5 of 2001 83 EC, stipulates that every member state in Europe should have a mechanism in place to allow access to medicines whilst they're still in clinical development. That's fantastic. The only challenge with that, as we've already alluded to, is that every member state in Europe has taken this directive and transposed it into its national law differently. So in Europe, you have 27 different approaches, systems, procedures, terminology to describe how this works. And in some countries, you even have different terminology and approaches when a product is completely investigational worldwide versus when it has a marketing authorization in one market. You have different mechanisms. Some countries have group approaches where you can have groups of patients that can be approved. Other countries, it's on an individual approach. So it does differ. But the good thing is about in Europe, every country in Europe does have legislation in place that governs this and allows patients in Europe to access these particular medicines prior to approval. Outside of Europe, it's fair to say it's just less clear. It's less clearly defined, but the majority of countries across the world, and this is just a representation of what some people call the emerging 7 countries, countries like the BRIC countries, do have legislation and mechanisms in place that allow patients to access the drug. So essentially, when you're looking globally, you can make a decision to provide access to patients across the world to your medicine while it's still in clinical development, whether that's using the approach in the US or using the named patient approach to the rest of the world. So if you wish to do that, one of the big questions is when can you consider this? And this is a very crude representation of a product life cycle. But essentially, the way the legislation sits is you can implement or make a product available to patients really at any point post-phase 2. Because when regulators are looking at whether a product can be used for a particular patient with an unmet medical need, they are making no judgment on that product's clinical efficacy. It's the prescribing physician that's making the clinical judgment to prescribe this product for a patient in their care, that's making a judgment call that they believe the product will benefit their patient. Most regulatory agencies across the world are only looking at this and making a judgment on what the risk or the potential risk is to that particular patient. So they're looking for an element of safety data. You certainly don't have to be post-phase 3 to implement these types of programs. And a lot of companies that we work with implement some form of early access program in parallel to their phase 3 clinical trials. So where there's patients that cannot enter the trials because maybe geographically they don't sit in the right country, they don't quite exactly meet the inclusion criteria, they have a mechanism that allows patients to access the products at that particular point in time. Certainly as you get later down the development pathway, you get to the point of phase 3 data being released, you get to the point of filing for registration, a number of companies will then choose to put these type of mechanisms in place. And then certainly at the point of your first launch globally, when you have the product available, maybe in the US, for example, often the first country to launch, companies will implement these types of schemes to allow patients the rest of the world to access the drug prior to the product being commercially and formally available in their particular country. So the decision at the moment and how it's implemented in practice is very much an internal decision on a company-by-company basis. But essentially you can start as early as phase 2. And in fact, we've worked with products that are still in phase 2 development for orphan designation areas and being made available to patients at that particular stage of the life cycle. So it's very much down to the treating physician believing a product will benefit their patient, the company being willing to make that product available. You can use these pretty much at any stage of the life cycle. So trying to start to pull this together and thinking about what the benefits are doing. So we've talked about the challenges, we've talked about very, very top line what the options are that are available to you. We've talked about when in a life cycle you can start to consider this type of approach. The benefits of making these types of products available at this stage of the life cycle are relatively, I think, obvious and clear. I think ethically, morally, medically, it's a fantastically positive situation to be in, to be able to respond to patient and physician demand. And we've heard how emotive the situation is for patients that are desperate to get their hands on these particular products, and for a company to be able to positively respond to those requests can be seen as a very positive approach at this stage in the life cycle. But I think it would be wrong to talk about making products available through early access without talking about the risks involved as well. And making products available through this route can actually help to complement the risk management strategy. And if we just take a second to look at some of the elements here, that if you do choose to make your products available prior to approval, you can implement a very, very controlled route to early access. So whilst we've said that it is down to the treating physician to make a judgment call whether they wish to prescribe the product for a patient in their care, it's very much down to the company to control and can control who they wish to have access to that particular medicine. So you can screen patients, you can screen physicians, you could educate physicians prior to allowing them access to the product prior to approval. So you can protect yourselves as an organisation against inappropriate use of the product or inappropriate access being gained by physicians or patients. And I think for the majority of companies that I speak to about this type of strategy, the biggest concern is the risk of untoward adverse events occurring through the course of the access program that could have implications for the marketing authorisation in the future. And hence why all companies that I've worked with that implement these type of programs have a very, very controlled route to how they would like their drug to be accessed and which particular type of patients they're willing to give access to. So it can complement the risk management strategy if you have clear guidelines and clear protocols put in place to govern how these mechanisms are implemented in practice. If you go back to the benefits that we were talking about, just to complete these, what's quite interesting in this formula, it's very clear you cannot capture data that will be used to support a marketing authorisation through this route. Because of the unsolicited nature of the request, particularly rest of the world, this is not controlled data that you're capturing. In fact, you're not allowed to capture solicited safety and efficacy data through an early access program, particularly rest of the world. You can in the US. But what you can capture through this is some really interesting information about real-life treatment decisions. You get a really clear view outside of your clinical trial program about how physicians are using this product, where they're placing it in the treatment regime, and the type of patients they're choosing for treatment. So although you can't capture safety and efficacy data, you can capture some very interesting real-world data about how these particular products are used. And often in the area of orphan drugs, there is no historical real-world data available to be able to use as you start to bring your considerations through to bringing the product to market. So you can capture some very interesting and useful additional data. You can certainly develop greater level of relationships with your key opinion leaders and your patient groups prior to use, making your product available, albeit through a very controlled means, because a broadened level of experience for product to patients, to physicians prior to approval. And there's going to be a benefit there in terms of when you come to formalise the approval and launch of having this greater level of experience available. And if you've chosen to charge for your product through this mechanism, you can also start to establish a price precedent for the point at launch. And this is one of the big differences of the rest of world approach to the US. Whilst in the US, the maximum you can do is recoup your costs of making your product available through an early access program. The rest of the world, you can actually charge a commercial price for your product through this particular route. And I know it's a little bit of a sort of an unwritten term that should be talked about, but for small biotechs, particularly developing these types of products, the only way they can make them available prior to approval is to make a charge, and at the very least, making drugs available will not cost them anything whilst they're going through their development process. So you can establish a price precedent prior to launch. So we've talked a little bit about the challenge, really top line today, but about the challenges, the options, some of the benefits that are available of making particularly orphan drugs available to patients and physicians prior to approval. If you're going to consider this as part of your strategy as you're going through your development program, I'd like to just leave you with just some key considerations that will help you contemplate whether it's the right thing to do for your particular product and when it might be the right thing to do. These will be in the slide deck that will be available online post the meeting, but I would propose that if this is something you are considering as part of your market access strategy for your orphan product, if you have a good view on these particular questions, then you're in a good starting place to decide how the right way of addressing this particular challenge is. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Any question for Mark? Wonderful. Please, we have a mic.
Thank you very much for that stimulating talk. This is Charlie Richard from Shire Human Genetic Therapies from the standpoint of the slightly beleaguered clinical developer, and wanted to ask you the important question about the challenges in ultra-rare disorders, not so much cystic fibrosis or Duchenne's where there's lots of patients, but where you need to go all over the world globally, especially in your phase 3 trials. And how to ensure that you can adequately get that very important evidence-based medicine and as strong as possible registration package in enrolling patients, while at the same time trying to imagine how to also allow early access for patients in the trials. And the second part of this question is that you said, well, it's easy for a company to control access, and I would argue it's certainly possible. You can set up protocols to do that, but once you, especially in rare diseases where there's no other therapeutic options available, once you open kind of that floodgates, I would say it's not easy to be able to do that.
So I can address the two questions one by one. So the first one, I think it's an absolutely fair point. When your primary objective is recruiting patients for your clinical trials and getting the data from the trials to support the marketing authorization. And a lot of companies will choose to have these types of programs in parallel with a route between the two, so that you can actually divert patients that are sourced in different locations across the world that maybe come through looking for early access. If they meet the trial criteria, they can be diverted into the clinical trial. And there's some benefits to that, particularly depending on whether your product's been made available free of charge or charged for, that you can allow patients free of charge drug through a clinical trial, which they might have to pay for or might not be able to afford to pay for outside of a clinical trial. And a physician access for a patient that is a lot more regulated than through the named patient route. So you can cross patients over. You have a follow-up question on that point?
Yeah, just one other statement. I think gone are the days early on when regulators would allow you to narrowly choose kind of a patient population and then bring that forward, and then other patients that perhaps weren't studied in clinical trials would then get access afterwards. I mean, I think example in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, where they want trials not just in ambulatory patients, but in non-ambulatory patients. And, they'd like in a very controlled way, the regulators would like you to study all groups of patients, which then, of course, increasingly narrows the amount of patients who don't qualify for clinical trials.
That's very true. And I think this is always a mechanism that sits alongside or behind the objective of the trials.
My foot here first.
The second question was...
Just more or less a statement. It's not that easy once you, in the very rare disorders where you can't choose amongst treatments and there's no other real treatments to it's just not easy to do that.
Vitska King-Ma Genzyme. I actually headed up the safety department for Genzyme for the past 17 years in orphan drugs, as well as the expanded access. So I think just a note of caution with regards to regulations that need to change if we do this, because what we've actually faced, not so much in Europe and US, but other areas, is that countries will actually allow patient import, but then mandate as part of the approval letter that we pay for that treatment forevermore for life. And so that's not much of a business model, and I know we need to try to be compassionate about how we bring access to treatment, but we've actually heard from the physicians in those countries that they would rather have people pay for it, because if it's free, it doesn't work as well as if it's paid for. So I think there's aspects to how to control how clinical trials in small settings in those countries may actually be better than expanded access.
Absolutely, I quite agree. And I think some of those considerations that we had on the screen, we're talking about, should you charge, should you not charge, and what are the benefits and risks of doing either one of those. And I think the other sort of core sort of piece of advice or take-home message is whatever your strategy is about what you want to achieve, you should have a clear strategy about how you exit from that program as well, and at what point that is, so you can manage expectations of key opinion leaders, of patient groups, and of regulators about how you will, or what point the program will cease, if it will cease at all, or whether you will commit to patients long term. And I think that's really important when you go into any one of these types of mechanisms. You have a clear view how you're going to exit that, and so people have expectations managed.
Great. Thanks a lot, Mark.